start. So welcome everybody. So great to have you all online with us. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And today I am here with Tom Donnelly, one of our top scholars. Yay!
Hello.
You guys, if you haven't met Tom Donnelly yet, he is a fantastic scholar. And today's session is really, really interesting. We know that the Second Amendment can be hard. We know it can be difficult for people to talk about. So what we're going to do is what we always do at the Constitution Center is make sure that we start looking at the text, but keeping our heads, as one of our teachers has said in our sessions, keeping our heads in the Constitution and in the law. So what does that mean? So the National Constitution Center is a nonprofit organization, and we are brought together to teach about the United States Constitution in a nonpartisan way. So what that really means is we want to look closely at what the Constitution says. We're going to look at the two different sections or two different parts of the Second Amendment today. And we're going to be asking big constitutional questions that we'll put in the chat box. And we want you to ask your constitutional questions back in the chat box and the Q&A box. And we're going to have an open and civil dialogue during this conversation. And we're going to dive deep into the history of the founding era, as well as the Reconstruction era, the time period after the Civil War. And then we're going to zoom all the way to modern times and look at cases like Heller. And what does the Second Amendment mean, and how these cases and times define their understanding today? And where is the parts that we still haven't had full clarity on? Where do we still are not sure? So we're going to dive into that. But again, we want you to stay with the constitutional questions. And the easiest way to think about that is a constitutional question starts with, can they do that? May the government do that? Can the government do that? What does the Constitution say it can or cannot do? If you start to think about questions like, I don't think we should do that, or we should be able to do that, when you hear the word should, that's typically a political question. So what we're asking you to do is separate your political from your Constitution and stay focused on the Constitution for this discussion. That's our job, that's our mission. And it does make it really better to dive into the Constitution and analyze it together. So I always think about putting the Second Amendment on the table and let's talk about it. So are you ready to get started, Tom?
I am.
Good, because the questions are already zooming in. So guys, keep it going. And I promise I'll make sure I ask Tom questions throughout, but mostly at the end. Let's go.
All right. Do you want to ask our question at the outset here, Kerry?
Let's get started with a question on you. So just in case you thought this was a relaxing lecture where you can just listen, you're wrong. We need your brains in the chat. So here's the question. Can a city ban handguns within the city limits? And we're going to be asking you this question multiple times during the chat and during the discussion today. You can answer yes, no. You can also say, I don't know, or I'm not sure, or I need more information. This is an exact case question from the Heller case. And remember, at the end of this program, I will send you a brief with all of our stories, the PowerPoint if you want it, as well as the links to the cases. So I'm going to put that in one more time. We're going to say
great answers.
There are great answers. Oof, there's a lot of them too. No, no, yes, no, yes, no. Okay, keep going. Okay. See, they're the smart cookies on the 1 p.m. session. Okay,
absolutely. No, they're 45 minutes ahead of us, so that's great.
I know, right?
Yeah. So let's kick off and let's start. You know, as I always do when interpreting the Constitution, with the Constitution's text itself. But first, I guess I should say hello. I'm Tom Donnelly. It's great to be with you. Yeah, no, I've been doing our middle school sessions, and I'm delighted to get to step in for Jeff here. Can't replace him, but I'll do my best to live up to his very high standards. But let's begin with the Constitution's text. And here's the Second Amendment: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So looking at the amendment's text, it's worth noting that it could be separated out into two clauses, which Kerry does very nicely here in this slide. So the first clause, lawyers call it the Preparatory Clause. Simple enough because it comes first. It's like a preface in a book. So it reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. So what's going on here? So this part of the amendment goes to the Second Amendment's connection to the founding generation's commitment to the citizen soldier. serving in a state organized militia. And the language expresses at least one of the amendment's core purposes. The amendment's trying to promote the security of a free state through a well-regulated militia, a militia organized by the state, led by members of the local community, gathering together members of the local community. So you serve with your family members and your friends and your neighbors. And so what's going on here? Well, many of the founders feared a national army filled with professional soldiers. This is what they mean by a standing army. A standing army is a national army, a professional army, an army of soldiers that are paid. And so what they feared is that they thought that history taught us that professional armies, hired guns by the national government, they're too often used to oppress the people. And so the idea here is that in America, we will have state organized militia that will help us protect ourselves, prevent the need for the national government to create a national standing army, and provide a way of really balancing between the needs of promoting public safety. We could have militia to do that while also preserving our freedom. And what does this translate to within our system of government? It's federalism. Federalism, dividing the power between the national government, the states, and the local government. And it's a way of preserving some of the traditional powers of state and local governments while limiting the national government. So the Second Amendment here protects our ability to arm ourselves so that we can carry out our militia duties without fear of a national government disarming us. That's the Preparatory Clause. That's the first clause, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Now let's move to what lawyers call the Operative Clause. And it reads, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is the more familiar part of the Second Amendment's text. And here it's expressing a core right of the people, the right to keep and bear arms. What's going on here? Well, some scholars, some justices, some judges argue that what's going on here is that what's being put in the Constitution is a pre-existing, pre-constitutional national right to keep and bear arms for our own self-defense. It's not about necessarily just militia service, but it's our own self-defense. This is something that goes back to the English Bill of Rights that we traveled with us across the Atlantic Ocean and came here into the United States. And so it's a separate clause. To remember though, the Second Amendment, like all of the rest of the Bill of Rights, it's only applying to the national government. It's not applying to state abuses. But here it's again expressing sort of a substantive right to keep and bear arms. And so much of what we're going to talk about today is what is the relationship between these two clauses? And just to not hide the ball at all, the key question really is, does that first clause, does that Preparatory Clause limit the right that we see in the second part of the amendment? Or is it just the expression of one purpose of the amendment that doesn't limit the pre-existing right to keep and bear arms as individuals? And so what does this bring up? Well, it brings up the core question at the heart of the constitutional debate over the Second Amendment, the one that really dominated discussion before the Heller decision in 2008, and that people still debate today. And that's, do these words, do they protect a right to keep and bear arms only when reasonably connected to military service or militia service? So this being what people call the collective rights view of the Second Amendment. Or does the Second Amendment also protect a freestanding right to keep and bear arms that's separate from militia service? Is it an individual right that is in each of us that isn't connected to militia service? And this is known as the individual rights reading of the Second Amendment. And so, we've talked enough about the Second Amendment so far, at least the text itself, that I'd love to just take an initial check. What do you think? Which do you think is the better initial reading of the Second Amendment's text? Does it come close? Do you think that the collective rights view is more correct, so that gun rights are connected to militia service, or the individual rights view is more correct, that it speaks of a freestanding individual right? You could put it up in the text box, and it's just an initial check before we get into the history.
And I think that's great. So collective or individual. So you can do a C or I if you want to keep it short in the text box too.
And you can see, I don't hide anything. I am, like many people, here I am in my son's room giving these lectures. And so I want to give you, a sense of where I'm coming from.
This is great. And I'm in a very dark, scary Constitution Center building, right? I wish our light was better when they took this picture. So it's a mix.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, the one thing that you can't emphasize enough, the few things you can't emphasize enough in this context with the Second Amendment is, one, as Kerry mentioned at the beginning, of course it's fraught with all sorts of political questions. We all have deeply held substantive views about this. But when it comes to the text and history of the Constitution, there are forceful arguments on both sides. These are cases that divided the justices 5-4. These are readings of text and history that have gotten people to actually cross ideological lines. Some people who support gun control measures also say that there's an individual right within the Second Amendment. So it's one where, at least among scholars, we've seen people separate out their constitutional views from their own policy views.
And what I think is interesting in the chat box right now, and everybody's so smart, I'm always so impressed, is they're saying collective during this time period. Some people are saying collective during this time period, but individual during this time period.
No, that's very sophisticated.
Yeah, I know. You guys you're analyzing it over time. And this is what we talked about in the last hours, looking at the Second Amendment during these 3 time periods and then putting it all back together again and saying, what is our understanding today? So great. And so as I go through this, I'm jumping back and forth into slides to help make sure that you guys can see the words, but also Tom's face, because I think it's important to hear the stories and see Tom too.
Well, that's great. So should we get into our founding stories?
Yes,
Kerry?
I think it's a perfect time. Does the individual right? Somebody asked this in the chat box. I just want to transfer it. Does it come from the Magna Carta directly, or is it the English Bill of Rights, or is it both? Sorry, I like to stump the 1 p.m. scholars.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I thought it came from the English Bill of Rights, but maybe there's something in Magna Carta. I'm not 100% sure. I've always read that it was the English Bill of Rights, but
and
don't hold me to that.
I will make sure it's in our notes that we send out after this, because I'm pretty sure there was a line Nicholas put in there and I can't remember. I think he said English Bill of Rights too, but I want to double check it.
Excellent. So if we're talking about the Second Amendment, and this goes to some of those great comments earlier in the chat box, we don't really just want to tell one founding story. We want to tell 2 sets of founding stories. So the first one's going to be about the American Revolution, the original Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And the second one's going to take us to the Civil War, Reconstruction, and what many scholars refer to as the Second Founding. But first, let's start with the founding era history. And so this really, from the founding era history, we're trying to draw out, I think, two lessons that the founding generation drew from this history. One is that many members of the founding generation were suspicious of standing armies, professional armies, again, paid by the government, separate from the citizen militias, and where you really have professional hired for gun soldiers. They were concerned about that. But second, that many members of the founding generation also greatly valued the citizen militia itself. These are militias organized by state and local governments. They're led by local community leaders, and they're comprised of members of the local community. So here, standing army on the top, that's a great way of looking at it too. And one thing to note when you're transporting yourself back to the founding generation is what the image of the citizen militia is. It's not just people divorced from government or their communities, just fighting for their own individual rights in themselves. Instead, militia service was tied to a certain Republican, small r Republican conception of citizenship. The idea that you owe a duty to your government to help protect it. You're going to do it in ways that are organized by your local and state leaders. You're going to join together, serve side by side with family members, with your neighbors, and you're going to come together and for the protection of your locality, of your state, and eventually even possibly your nation. And you're doing that to promote public safety and the common good. So it really is, take seriously, a state organized militia. So where's the founding generation drawing these lessons that eventually lead to the Second Amendment? Well, first, Kerry had a picture already up about Boston. And so, one of the first images to think about is, British Army in the colonies. Think of Boston in the 1770s. Think of something like the Quartering Acts, which I just saw Kerry having that particular picture up there too. And so if we're, look at Boston 1775. Boston at that point in time has 16,000 people, but the British have now suspended colonial self-government in Boston, and more to the point, they send 4,000 British soldiers to Boston. So there's 16,000 Bostonians, there's 4,000 British soldiers, and what do they force the Bostonians to do? You have to house them. You have to feed those soldiers. You have to put up with their harassment at times. And so for the founding generation, the suspicion of big professional standing armies, it's personal to them. They're dealing with this in their personal experience, housing soldiers, feeding them, being denied their right to self-government. And so this experience colored the meaning of standing armies for early Americans. And also, actually, apart from the Second Amendment, it would also, of course, lead to the Third Amendment, which we never talk about, but I can pull out here on my phone.
There you go.
Oh, you have it right there. That has to do with the quartering of soldiers. Of course you do, Kerry. And here it is. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So here, the founding generation, very, very concerned about standing armies, their abuses, and having in mind very much the oppression that they felt from the British Army. And then it's no accident that, as they're putting together the Declaration of Independence, explaining to the world why we must be free of King George III, one of the things they mention specifically in there is that, quote, he kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures, and had effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. So the argument here for the founding generation growing out of this experience, professional armies like the British Army couldn't be trusted. European monarchs, despots, use these armies to oppress the people. We in America want to limit standing armies, and we really, really value the virtues of citizen soldiers and state organized militias. So again, it's all about federalism. It's about state authority. It's about a state organized militia. And there's a connection between, the state, your civic responsibilities, your duty to your state, and Republican virtue, really trying to come together to protect public safety and promote the common good. It's actually analogous. One way to think about it is it's a lot like jury duty. The jury was really, really important to the founding generation. And the jury there connecting both a duty that you owe to the state, so it's a part of your Republican responsibilities. So you have to do it to serve your community. But on the flip side, it's also an important check on government power. When it comes to, the jury, it's checking overzealous prosecutors. And in the context of the militia, it's a way of really taking care of yourselves and keeping your community safe and taking that responsibility yourselves in organized state militias. So here, as we're fast forwarding, so that's the American Revolution. As we know, the American Revolution ends, America prevails. As we're getting into the Constitutional Convention, we see delegates drawing upon these experiences as they're figuring out how to craft a new constitution, and also, frankly, why to oppose the new Constitution. So, of course, we know before the Constitution itself, we had the Articles of Confederation, which governed us, throughout a lot of the American Revolution and the period after that. But this was a weak government. And leaders like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, eventually George Washington, argued that we needed a stronger government than that to govern a new nation, a nation that would be great. And so this is why eventually we have the delegates gathering in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, again, right across a big field from the National Constitution Center today in Independence Hall. And so the convention delegates are tasked first with amending the articles, but instead they overstep their actual instructions, and they draw up a new charter, a new constitution, a new form of government. And one of the great debates that extends over many of the days here is how are we going to balance power between, one, the branches of government at the national level, so the president, Congress, and the courts, but importantly, and this is so important to the Second Amendment, how are we going to balance the powers of the national government, the new national government, versus the traditional powers of the states? And as they're doing this, as they're trying to figure this out, one of the questions they're asking is, what is the relationship between a professional army, a standing army, the traditional state organized militia, and the states? How are we going to rebalance that as we form a stronger national government? And they're drawing again upon lessons from the American Revolution we already talked about. One, delegates feared standing armies. They remembered the British Army. They remembered those abuses. But two, from the revolution itself, some of the delegates also feared relying on poorly trained militias to defend the nation. And so the question is, how are we going to ensure public safety without imperiling our freedom? And so
I was going to say, this is where they're like at a crossroads.
Absolutely.
This big fear of what the government, if it got too big, could do to the army, could do to the people, but then the fear of local people being in charge of the militia, and how do you balance that? And so they're thinking all these things, and they're putting them in and having these debates during the convention through the Bill of Rights, correct?
Absolutely. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, you want to jump into that Constitution?
I would love to jump into the Constitution. And here we see apart from people who study the Second Amendment, this isn't particular language that you're going to come across very often. These are known among, constitutional lawyers as the militia clauses of the original Constitution. And so I'll read this one. It said, this is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So this is the part of the Constitution that's saying what powers the new Congress has, the new national government has. And Congress shall have power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasion. So here it's saying that the national government can draw on these pre-existing militia to help protect us. That it doesn't necessarily need to rely on a standing army, but it has the power to call forth the militia. So that's the first part. The next part here, Kerry, I'm not going to read it all, but effectively what it says is, one, Congress also does have power to discipline, to regulate the militia. So this is a new power for the national government, one that you can imagine some delegates were pretty, pretty angry about. Delegates and also people, anti-federalists opposing the Constitution later. But also within here, it preserves two core powers of the states. One, it says states, you will continue to appoint the leaders of the militia. And two, you will continue to have authority to train the militia. And so it's trying to strike a balance between giving the national government new powers to regulate the militia, to make sure that they aren't poorly trained, while also preserving some of those traditional powers of the states to select the leaders of militia, to train them, to maintain a certain level of control. And then the last part is that Article 1, Section 8 does also give Congress the power to raise an army and to create a navy. So Congress does have new powers to create standing armies, and there's no text in the Constitution that limits this to times of war. So they can be standing armies in times of peace. This is that if you're looking for the big point here with these militia clauses, it's that they do preserve some powers of the states over the militia, but it's giving the national government a whole lot of new broad authority to establish peacetime standing armies and to regulate the militia. And as you might expect, and we're not going to go into all of the details of the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, so the Federalists, the supporters of the Constitution, versus the Anti-Federalists, those who oppose the Constitution. But I do want to highlight the key arguments on either side, because people, they really do debate standing armies. They do debate, whether or not the Constitution should have included language protecting the militia, protecting gun rights associated with the militia. And so the two sides here are, if you're looking at one poll, you would have Alexander Hamilton, writing in the Federalist Papers. So these Federalist Papers are, again, newspaper essays written by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, arguing in support of the Constitution. They're effectively long newspaper op-eds in support of the Constitution. And so Alexander Hamilton is basically saying, you can't have language in a Constitution that limits standing armies. We need them to keep us safe. And I mean, if I'm reading between the lines of Hamilton here, it's almost as though he's telling the Anti-Federalists, grow up, we have a real country, we need a professional army.
He actually might have been saying that.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, that's there. I'm not going to read it, but I'm sure that'll be in the materials we send. But that's effectively what Hamilton's saying. He's like, we need a standing army. James Madison takes more of a middle position where he says, one, if you're a modern state, you need to be able to form a standing army. But two, he did take the Anti-Federalist fears of the dangers of a standing army seriously. So what he says is, Anti-Federalists, you may fear this professional army tethered to the new national government may oppress the American people, but don't be too afraid of that. Those fears are overblown. Why is that? Well, unlike a lot of other countries, one, America has militia. America has citizens organized by their states in militia, and two, Americans, unlike other people, they're armed. And so the idea here being that, well, the professional army may have 25,000, 35,000 hired guns, always interposed on the other side will be militia of hundreds of thousands of Americans. And so effectively, James Madison is saying, the standing army is not going to press its luck. And so there's going to be, protections built into this pre-existing arrangement where the militia and the people being armed will actually protect liberties and allow us to really, again, like the key question is, can you balance public safety against individual liberty and the authority of states to form militias? So that's the Federalist side. What do the Anti-Federalists say? Well, the Anti-Federalists say what you might expect. Didn't you learn anything from the American Revolution? Did we forget that we were just occupied by a British army? Aren't you afraid that this national government that's going to be in some, whether it's Philadelphia, whether it's New York, some big city away from the rest of us, aren't you afraid that they're not going to really have in mind, all of our core liberties or care about us as a people? And so what we have here, and George Mason, one of the important figures here at the founding, a Virginian, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, one of the three delegates who didn't sign the Constitution at the end, George Mason, Edmund Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry. And George Mason explained afterwards, why it was he didn't sign the Constitution. And for each of those delegates who didn't sign, they were concerned there was no Bill of Rights. in the original Constitution, but they also really took seriously and were really concerned that there was no protection. Here he says it right here, that there's no protection against the danger of standing armies in times of peace. So the anti-federalists like George Mason really cared about this. And in the anti-federalist writings, they say what you might expect, which is that, that the new Constitution is giving, and this is the Federal Farmer, of Richard Henry Lee, one of the key anti-federalists, saying right here that you're giving the national government so much new power to raise armies and to regulate our militia. That's dangerous. You have Brutus, who was thought to be New York's Robert Yates, also an anti-federalist, warning of that this is a sign of the national government consolidating power that could, quote, result in the destruction of liberty. These are really strong words. And so following these ratification debates, the Constitution's ratified. We don't have the language about standing armies in there. But James Madison, his Federalist allies, take these concerns seriously. And so that's how we end up with the Bill of Rights. You have James Madison in the first Congress being the primary author of the Bill of Rights. He opposed a Bill of Rights actually to begin with. But these debates and probably political reality got him to change his mind and said, no, we do need a Bill of Rights, in part just to bring these anti-federalists into the new project of American government. And so as he's doing this, he's drawing on many of the proposals of the anti-federalists and ratifying conventions, various state constitutions, which have provisions dealing with militia, standing armies, and an individual right to self-defense. And he's putting together what become, eventually 12 amendments that are approved by Congress, and then 10 that are ratified by the states. They become the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment's one of them. And I'll just end with this, because I know we've spent a lot of time on the founding era, but it's so important. It's what the court's going to debate in part in District of Columbia versus Heller, which we're going to see. But there are two big things to take from this founding moment. One is that the US Constitution is giving the national government new broad authority to raise an army and to regulate the militia. The flip side is that the Second Amendment takes seriously the anti-federalist concerns that the national government may use this power in the militia clauses to regulate the militia in order to disarm the militia. And so the Second Amendment is clearly saying, no, you can't do that. At a bare minimum, you can't do that. And so the Second Amendment's taking those concerns seriously. Whether it does more or it does that or does more is the topic of ongoing debate.
Okay, so real quick, number one, if any AP students, this should help you with your test next week. So good luck, because they have to go these founding documents.
Exactly, yes.
Good luck, and Friday will help you again with that. But Kit had a question, and I think she had it in a different group, and I really think it's a great question just for clarifying. Mm-hmm. So is the National Guard the current equivalent of a militia or something else? And then she goes on to say, is this a collective right, or does it have to be connected with an institution, or can people organize apart from the government? So a little clarity around what the heck is a militia in today's understanding.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I mean, I think the way to think about it is, I think, yes, the National Guard is a state organized militia of sorts, I think, but it's important to, so the way I'd answer it is to think about what we have today versus what the founding generation was really talking about. And so the National Guard really is just a really small subset of everyone who could possibly defend their community. Whereas the militia, so when the Second Amendment talks about a well-regulated militia, it's a really broad swath of people. It's all able-bodied, in that case, men who could be called upon to muster to defend the state and the state or the locality. And so it was connected to a very broad civic responsibility of a lot of people. And so even if you say the National Guard is the equivalent of some sort of state organized militia, the institution itself is so different than what they were talking about and what they really valued in the founding generation. But I think if what you're looking at is what is the core of the militia for purposes of the Second Amendment, that it ends up, it's a well-regulated militia. It's a militia that's organized by the state. And again, I think the way to think about it is, and it's led by community leaders, and it's filled with members of the local community, all quote unquote able-bodied, full-bodied, men who can serve and defend the community.
Got it. Awesome. And then I think the next section that we get into is really going to help look at what does this mean in the lens of an individual right and for whom. And then Heller almost is where. I always like to break it down in those big buckets.
Yeah.
Because that's some of the questions that are popping up for clarification. So starting in the 1787, 1791 time period, looking at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, analyzing that, where did the ideas come from and how were they put into our Constitution? Now, fast forward time leap in time, and we go to the 1860s and the Civil War. So let's look at the same amendment again during this time period. I'm sorry as I'm flying through all the slides, everybody. Here we go, Civil War, Second Amendment.
All right, excellent. I'm sorry, Joseph Story, that you didn't get the prime time you were looking for there, but
I can't give them any more.
Exactly. Let's go to the Civil War, Reconstruction, and America's second founding. And the framing question here is, how did the Civil War, Reconstruction, and this second founding transform debates over the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms? And specifically, why were gun rights so important to African Americans in the South following the Civil War? So let's first start with the Civil War itself, because I think it's a good linkage between the founding history we just talked about and get us into this period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So the Civil War first confirmed the national government's broad power to conscript citizens. So here it validated the constitutionality of a military draft. So military draft allowed the national government to directly enlist you in a national army, so it circumvented the state militias. It was a real assertion of national power, and it was a real topic of constitutional debate. So, the President Lincoln, the Republicans argued that this was very much within the power of the national government to have a military draft, to build an army that way. But the flip side is that opponents of the administration, many of them Democratic lawyers in the North, they opposed this move. They said the military draft was unconstitutional. It went against the powers granted to the national government in the militia clauses. It went against the Second Amendment. It was a national power grab. And you see many of their arguments echoing those concerns about an oppressive standing army and oppressive national government as part of these debates. But in the end, the Democrats lose this argument. We have a military draft. The Union Army wins the war. And then the Civil War and then Reconstruction alters our understanding in many ways of the Second Amendment. Let me say a little bit about how that happened. So Civil War is over. White Southern states so former Confederates are beginning to reassert their powers of self-government. What do? What's among the first things they do? Well, they enact the Black Codes. So the Black Codes, again, we've talked about them in the last few weeks, but these are laws that discriminate against newly formerly enslaved people and basically put them in a condition of semi-slavery. What's important here is that part of these Black Codes are often they're there to disarm African Americans, to take their firearms away, even African Americans who had served in the Union Army. So it's trying to disarm African Americans, and that's where that quote you had there, Kerry, up on the screen from Frederick Douglass comes in. So it's Frederick Douglass here arguing that as a result of these Black Codes, we need the national government to step in, to take action, to protect African American rights, to protect themselves through the use of guns. And here's the quote: "The Black man has never had the right either to keep or bear arms, and the legislatures of the states will still have the power to forbid it. We need the national government to step in to protect this key right." At the same time, for this generation, the National Army, victorious in the Civil War, becomes a symbol for many Americans, especially African Americans, not of tyranny, not of repression, but of liberty, of freedom, of equality, battling for those values. And private militias, on the flip side, become associated with groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which are gathering together in arms. They're formed after the Civil War, and they become a symbol of white supremacy and use violence against African Americans to repress their constitutional rights. So this terrorism by the Ku Klux Klan led African Americans and many of their white allies to embrace the Second Amendment right, to allow African Americans and their white allies, frankly, to protect themselves from white violence, especially in the South, especially done by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So this turns the founding era debate over standing armies on its head. And it's no wonder then, and we'll get to we could talk about Ida B. Wells for a long time.
I know. This is why I just had to put her up there for a little longer.
Yeah, no, I love having her up there as we talk about all of this Reconstruction history, because she's such a powerful figure. But what we see as a result of these concerns are, one, we see African Americans laying claim to their own constitutional rights. I have a quote here from what we're seeing throughout the South are groups of African Americans meeting in conventions, putting together petitions that are stating what they take to be their core constitutional rights, what they want from the Civil War, what they want from Reconstruction. And here's a group from South Carolina, and it's so powerful. Pardon me for reading it in full. This is African Americans gathered in convention in South Carolina in the 1860s. "We, the people of the state of South Carolina, in convention assembles, ask that inasmuch as the Constitution of the United States explicitly declares that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, that the late efforts of the legislature of this state," so the Black Codes, "to pass any act to deprive us of arms be forbidden as a plain violation of the Constitution." So these are African Americans saying, we already have this right like every other white American, please protect it. And Republicans in Congress end up taking many actions, passing many different laws, ratifying the 14th Amendment, in part to vindicate those rights. They're hearing, they're looking at the Black codes, those forms of repression. They're getting these petitions from conventions of African Americans saying that we need an individual right to keep and bear arms, to protect our home, to protect our families. And so, as Congress is debating the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the nation's first major civil rights law, you see it's one of its primary authors, Lyman Trumbull, the senator from Illinois, specifically saying, we're going after the Mississippi Black Code here. The Mississippi Black Code says that African Americans can't, quote, have firearms. They can, and we're going to say that here in the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Or we see Senator Samuel Pomeroy of Kansas saying a quote. I'm going to read this quote, and then we'll get to Ida B. Wells. But Senator Samuel Pomeroy in this debate saying, if the cabin door of the freedman is broken open and the intruder enters for purposes as vile as were known to slavery, then should a well-loaded musket be in the hand of the occupant, every man should have the right to bear arms for the defense of himself, his family, and his homestead. And so we see in debates over the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and debates over the Freedmen's Bureau Act, in debates over the 14th Amendment itself, the Reconstruction Republicans returning to these concerns about white violence in the South, the need for African Americans to have guns to protect themselves because their governments are not going to protect them, or maybe they don't even have the capacity to protect them even if they wanted to. And that this right to have a gun to protect oneself is a core privilege or immunity of national citizenship. And so here we see as a capper, Ida B. Wells. This is in 1892. So it's, 25 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, but it captures, I think, the power of how many people felt during this period. A Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every Black home. When the white man knows he runs as great a risk of biting the dust every time his African-American victim does, he will have a greater respect for African-American life. And so that gives you a sense of, we're very far from, the public musket, state organized militias meeting in town greens, and now talking more about the use of guns as an individual right. And so that's what's growing out of this experience of African Americans during Reconstruction. And I'll pause there, Kerry. I don't know if there are questions or if you want to tee up anything.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to poll the group, because we've had these conversations and over time with the Constitution Center, but how many of you knew these stories around Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, and like kind of this time period? Is this something that's new, something you've heard, or something you knew well? I guess you can answer in the chat box. New.
Excellent.
Yeah. And I think one of the new, got it, awesome. Send them in as I say. I totally agree with you. Barely talked about, yep, Kit, I'm there with you. I think one of the interesting things is when I look at the right to bear arms, the question always comes up about regulation of the arms as well, and how's that happened over time. And I think it's really interesting to look at the right and regulation and how that has changed over time. And so, I know we talk about Nelson Lund is on our interactive constitution, and he says like, okay, you can't have a cannon, or some giant mass destruction. Where's that regulation? And I don't think it comes up in this context often. So I mean, Tom's my favorite storyteller on this time period. So I think it's a great to see. You really are. But this is great to kind of see where you all are too. So kind of looking at this time period, do you want to talk about Colfax and Cruikshank real quickly, and then we'll jump to 2008?
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And I mean, just one final point, and that's a great frame here, Kerry. And I'm glad to hear that a lot of people hadn't heard these stories. When we're asking the constitutional questions that come to the modern day, I think what we have to keep in mind is the Constitution's text. This history should inform how we read the text, or it may inform how we read the text. But then difficult questions, like you just said, Kerry, of where do we then draw the line when it comes to specific gun regulations, remain topics of ongoing debate. And it's what we'll see divide many different things. The text, the history, and the scope of government power over regulation divides the justices, divides scholars. And so these are really fruitful areas of debate. But I hope that at least we're providing some of the tools to understand the text and the history that goes into those debates constitutionally. So that's just a bit. It's all to say, keep learning. These stories are very powerful. But the Colfax massacre. So the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. And what we see is over the next 2 decades, the Supreme Court does return to the 14th Amendment and its relationship to the Second Amendment 2 times, really 2 times during this period in cases. One is a case called Cruikshank versus United States. It's 1876. This is 8 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. And this case sadly arose out of one of the largest, if not the largest, incidents of white violence against African Americans during Reconstruction. So this is the Colfax massacre of April 1873. It takes place in Louisiana. Effectively, what happens is a group of African Americans end up first it's a local African American militia leader took control of a courthouse in Colfax. There's a murder of African Americans 5 miles away. A lot of African Americans are fearful of additional white violence. They congregate at this courthouse, and then a group of about 150 armed white men come to the courthouse. They set fire to it, and as African Americans are fleeing the courthouse, they gun them down. And so this kills over 100 people. And it's one of just the most striking instances of just of terrible violence during a very violent period, Reconstruction. And so what happens is the national government actually has new authority under what were called the Ku Klux Klan Acts or the Enforcement Acts. They have a couple of different names, but effectively it allows the national government to prosecute these sorts of actions where people are acting to deny, in this case, African Americans of their constitutional rights. It's often associated with the right to vote, but here also it's associated with the right to assemble and the right to keep and bear arms. And so the question is, should these charges stand? And the Supreme Court rules that that the federal government's actions were improper here. It throws out the charges against these alleged murderers, and it says a few different things. One is that this was violence carried out by private people. It wasn't carried out by the state or local government. So the national government doesn't have power to protect constitutional rights in that context. It's what lawyers call the state action doctrine. The idea being that the 14th Amendment says no state shall, not that no one shall. And this is where Chief Justice Morrison Waite, who wrote the court's opinion here, expresses it as the sovereignty for this purpose rests alone with the states. So if you're an African American who had your rights violated in that way through violence, go to your state, go to your local government. The national government doesn't have a role here. Good luck with that throughout most of Reconstruction if you're an African American or one of their white allies in the South. The next part, though, is Chief Justice Waite also says of the Second Amendment, basically the Second Amendment still, even after we ratify the 14th Amendment, the Second Amendment still only applies to the national government. It does not apply to actions by the state. So even if the state had acted here, the Second Amendment doesn't reach this action. We see a follow-up. It's a different set of questions, but another case with a similar gloss on the Second Amendment called Presser versus Illinois, which takes place about a decade after that. But the Supreme Court basically doubles down on the idea that the Second Amendment is not going to apply to abuses by state and local governments, that it still is, its core meaning is going after the national government. So I'll leave those stories there, and I'd love to get it. We have 15 minutes left. Get into the modern questions, the modern cases. If that works for you, Kerry.
I think that works great, and I'm gonna just tee up the question again since we have the image on.
Yeah, perfect.
And then we have a couple really good questions in the Q&A box that I want to make sure we get to around the Mulford Act. So I'll just tee that up from Aaron as we go through that. But here's the question for all of you. So back to that original question that we asked you in the beginning of the class. And this really has a lot to do with the District of Columbia v. Heller. Can a city ban handguns within the city limits? So answer that one for me, guys. Yes, no, I'm not sure. Back and forth kind of answering that question. No, we're going to get into that now. So we've gone from the late 1700s to the late 1800s to 2008. Nope. Alvin's the only one. Nope. Yes. No. Good. Still unclear. Awesome, Andrew. Totally get it. Okay. So Tom, Heller, can you kind of break down Heller for us? Kind of what is the regulation in Heller? What is and where? It really talks about what and where and whom. All those things always come up.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, one quirk of Heller in this entire area of the law is to note that while the Second Amendment's old, while the 14th Amendment's old, this case law is very new. So the landmark cases on the Second Amendment are from 2008 and 2010. Again, the court had said some things in Cruikshank, some things in Presser, the other case I just talked about, another case in 1939 called Miller. And in each of those cases, the court doesn't say a lot about the Second Amendment, but it does read the right very narrowly. In the Miller case in 1939, it endorses what we talked about at the beginning, the collective rights view of the Second Amendment, that the right there is connected, it has to be reasonably connected to militia service. So the actual case law that's governing today is really from 2008 onward, beginning with District of Columbia versus Heller, which was decided in 2008. So what happened in Heller? Well, the District of Columbia passed a law that effectively banned handguns in the city. So this goes back to our hypothetical from the beginning and that Kerry just asked about. And so what are the two sides saying here? Well, Dick Heller is the challenger. And so he says that District of Columbia can't pass a law like this. It violates the Second Amendment. He says that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to keep and bear arms, not simply a right connected to militia service. And one of the main reasons that we value this right is precisely to use guns to protect our homes. While African Americans during Reconstruction may have cared about white violence by the Ku Klux Klan, in modern America, many people who live in cities fear violence from burglars, from intruders, from local gangs. And so that it's important to protect a Second Amendment right to individual gun possession in order to protect your home for self-defense. And that Heller said, in this context, handguns are the most effective means of defending one's home. And that when the government bans that type of firearm, it infringes a core Second Amendment right. That's Dick Heller's side. That's the challenge he's making to this District of Columbia law. What does the District of Columbia say? Well, they argue, obviously, that their law here, the ban on handguns, is constitutional. And so they argue the collective rights view of the Second Amendment. They say that the Second Amendment at its core is about rights reasonably connected to militia service, that you can't really draw that connection between the handgun ban and militia service here with this case, with the DC handgun law. It says that the Supreme Court itself has read the Second Amendment quite narrowly over time. It's endorsed in Miller in 1939, the collective rights view, and that throughout American history, state and local governments have both valued gun rights, but also regulated those rights from colonial America all the way through into the 21st century. And that gun laws like the DC handgun law serve an important purpose by giving law enforcement the tools it needs to get dangerous guns, particularly dangerous guns like handguns, out of the hands of criminals. As a result, DC argues that its law doesn't violate the Second Amendment. So which side wins here? Well, in a 5-4 decision, Dick Heller wins, the challenger wins. The person arguing that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms for protecting one's home wins. The DC law is struck down. It's declared unconstitutional. And so we have, in the end, the Supreme Court in 2008 really reinvigorating the Second Amendment as a tool for challengers to go after different gun regulations throughout the country. And so it's a departure from Miller, from the old case from 1939. And it's a new it's a new area of law that the Supreme Court is going to have to fill in over time. But sort of going back to what Kerry said at the beginning, that these are hard questions. They're hard questions constitutionally when it comes to the Constitution's text, the related history, how we parse it, what we think is right, how we think to apply it to laws today. That's all true. And this case divided the justices 5-4. And very interestingly, the majority opinion, which was written by Justice Antonin Scalia, and the dissent, which was written by Justice John Paul Stevens, both basically argue over the same materials. They're both returning to the text of the amendment, they're returning to the founding era history, and trying to apply it to the DC law. And so, should I go into the reasoning, or do we want to go?
Yeah, Actually, Mark just said Scalia was an originalist and said this. And then the next question was Larry. So they want more clarification. Larry said, and by Heller's ruling, does that mean goodbye prefatory clause? And so, yeah, a little bit more clarification, and I'll give you some images on those so you can read them.
No, those are really terrific questions. And there's Justice Antonin Scalia. Yeah, I mean, I think if you were looking at this case at the beginning, the two sides raised different questions about the future of the Second Amendment. I would say, if the Second Amendment, so if you're on Dick Heller's side, you'd probably ask, if the Second Amendment doesn't strike down the DC law, then what's left of the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms? Does it place any limits on government? So that's the one side, that's the Dick Heller side. On the flip side, on the DC side, surely what they asked and the question on everyone's mind was, if this law goes, one, I think you're right. What do we make of the Preparatory Clause? Does it, how do we read that? How do we account for that in the majority's opinion? But projecting forward, if the DC handgun law goes, what other gun regulations have to go? guns, gun regulation, gun bans on guns in sensitive places like government buildings or schools, restrictions on guns for ex-felons, for domestic violence, people convicted of domestic violence. What does it mean for laws that restrict when we can carry guns outside the home? So that goes to the Mulford Act question. All of these questions are raised, and the court is going to be open. It's going to have to answer all of these challenges in subsequent cases. And that's precisely the world we're in, where the court, Heller was 2008. The follow-up case, I'll come back to Justice Scalia, but I'll just put McDonald quickly on the table.
Yep, great.
So Heller's in 2008, McDonald's 2010. McDonald just asked the natural follow-up question from Heller. So this goes back to your question of the where question, Kerry, at least one of the where questions, which is Heller dealt with the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia is not a state. It's subject to federal laws. And so Dick Heller was able to bring his challenge under the original Second Amendment, the original Bill of Rights. It applies only to federal laws. And McDonald asked the natural follow-up question, which is, does the right recognized in Heller to a Second Amendment individual right to keep and bear arms to protect your home, does it apply to state laws like the one in Heller? Does it apply to state and local laws as well? And the court there said yes, again in a 5-4 decision. So it's what lawyers, and we've talked about in the last few weeks, call incorporation. It's the idea that through the 14th Amendment, we can now apply many of the rights of the Bill of Rights against state and local laws. So it's extending those rights and allowing us to bring those claims under the US Constitution. So McDonald answered that question again, though, in a 5-4 decision. But I don't mean to jump around, but I don't think we need to say that much more about McDonald, other than read the opinions in that case. They're fascinating because they talk really so much about the Reconstruction era history that we already reviewed earlier in our session today. And so it's very interesting. The court doesn't always do that, but it takes the second founding, the Reconstruction history, very seriously. But returning to Heller, the arguments came down to what you would expect. On Justice Scalia's side, what he effectively said is that the key clause, the key right here goes back to that second clause, the operative clause that we talk about so often, which is the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Scalia argues again that this is a pre-existing right, pre-constitutional right, a natural right, one that the Second Amendment's merely recognizing through the text here. And to the Preparatory Clause, what he says is the Preparatory Clause, that being a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free people, it states out one possible purpose of the amendment. It doesn't restrict the entire reach of the next clause. It says one of the reasons why we have this amendment, as he put it, for the majority, he would say the clause could be phrased like this: because a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So it's related to militia service initially. That's a core purpose of it, but it's not the only purpose. And so Scalia makes, but that's sort of the key textual arguments that Scalia makes there, and some of the history. The flip side is Justice Stevens says, I think both sides make the forceful arguments that are, as is often the case with the justices, forceful arguments that are best on either side. Stevens takes Scalia on the Constitution's text and on the Constitution's history, and he draws on that founding era history that we talked about at the beginning, saying that the founding generation was really concerned about standing armies. They really valued citizen militias, state organized militias. That's what the dance between the militia clauses of the original Constitution and the Second Amendment was all about. The Second Amendment, then, we need to read it in light of the Preparatory Clause. So Stevens makes the complete opposite argument based on the same text, that he makes the opposite argument from Scalia. He says we have to read the preparatory text as informing the scope of the right that we see after that. And so that he argues the collective rights view, that because of the Preparatory Clause, we need to read that right, the right to keep and bear arms, and relate it to, it has to be reasonably related to militia service. That's what the Second Amendment was about. The Second Amendment wasn't about going after regulations of the private use of arms. And here's the last point, and that's the quote you have up there, Kerry, which is he also draws on the framing history. And he says, when James Madison is drafting the First Amendment, when the first Congress is debating it, when we the people are debating it over ratification, what they have at their disposal are original state constitutions, which have different provisions dealing with guns, dealing with militia, dealing with standing armies. Then they have proposals from the state ratifying conventions by the Anti-Federalists. And so as they're putting together the clause, they have examples of language that protect an individual right to self-defense and examples that are dealing with military uses. And Stevens argues that it was a conscious choice by the founding generation to write about the militia and not to write more broadly about a right to self-defense. And so the final capper for Stevens, though, and this is where he goes back to the Supreme Court's case law. So it's not just, it's the text, it's the founding era history, but he also looks at what the Supreme Court had said about the Second Amendment before. And he said that the court has decided a few cases, old cases on the Second Amendment, that limit the right to the collective rights reading, to a reading that's tethered to militia service. And that what the Supreme Court is doing, what the majority is doing here, is unsettling decades upon decades of law that judges have relied on, that legislatures have relied on in debating, the legislatures in debating which gun regulations to put in place, and the courts have used in assessing different challenges under the Second Amendment of those regulations, and that the burden was on the majority to put forth a better argument for unsettling all of those years of law. And Stevens and the dissenters, the three other justices, so it's a 5-4 decision, closely divided, say that the majority didn't meet that burden.
So, and that's basically what I'm seeing, that same discussion go back and forth in the chat box.
Yeah.
Yeah, like some saying like, wait, how can you have a militia if you don't have individual gun rights? And then the second part, which like Mark brought up, like, well, but the militia is first. And like, if you're going to use originalism, you need to have a better founding for it. So I love that they're, speaking to the justices directly. But one of the questions, Tom, that came up earlier and you brought up a minute ago, is that this decision kind of didn't give all the answers. It just said, here's our decision here. But what about schools? What about these other locations, these other places? How much? Are there any current court cases around the Second Amendment that we're seeing in this term, or ones that are bubbling up from the state courts?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court did actually take its first Second Amendment case since McDonald just this term. It was called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus City of New York. And it went to the natural follow-up question from Heller and McDonald, which is, how do these rights apply to possessing guns outside of the home? But the court wound up dismissing this case for technical reasons. So we still have no more clarity on the scope of the Second Amendment from the Supreme Court, but there are a bunch of challenges happening in the lower courts. And we can imagine they're working their way up to the Supreme Court. And it seemed, because the court took that particular case, the Rifle and Pistol Association case, after denying review of a lot of Second Amendment cases for years, it suggests that we may see another one soon. What we know from, so I think the last thing I'd like to place on the table from Heller and McDonald is, so what do we know? What does Heller and McDonald settle? What does it place on the table, and what does it leave unsettled? So one, it does begin to establish a legal framework for applying the Second Amendment. So again, it establishes a core principle. The Second Amendment protects an individual right to gun possession for purposes of protecting one's home. That's a core principle. It also sets out an outer boundary, it's sort of like a boundary, it sets an initial boundary for where that is going to apply and strike down laws. And it chooses, with the District of Columbia law in Heller and the Chicago law in McDonald's, two of the strictest gun control laws in the country. And it says, no, you can't do that. We're not going to tell you, everything about what's going to go and what's going to stay, but at the very least, we're going to set the line here. At the same time, the court was very clear in Heller, and they reaffirmed this in McDonald's, that the Second Amendment, much like the rest of the Bill of Rights, it's not an absolute right. And so they're going to have to do some line drawing about when there might be permissible regulation by by various governments and when not. And the court even said that there are certain, through history, certain regulations that we would look at as, quote, presumptively lawful. So we would enter a challenge thinking, yeah, these are probably okay. And they give examples: longstanding prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and mentally ill, laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places like schools and government buildings, law imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms, and then also noted that there's a historical tradition of, quote, prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. And so here it's the majority in Heller saying that the Second Amendment might protect your right to have ordinary handguns, but not bazookas, not nuclear weapons, not these unusual arms.
You can't have that cannon.
Yeah, exactly. But, again, like between the core principle, striking down these really restrictive laws and then saying these laws are okay, so many of the things in the middle are just going to have to be, continue debated in politics, in the courts, and eventually at the Supreme Court before we can really cash this out. Again, it took a long, it would take decades upon decades for us to get the First Amendment as we know it today, as the court sort of sussed out what the key principles, what the doctrinal tests are going to be, et cetera. And you can expect the same with the Second Amendment.
Yeah, and I think that is the thing that we all need to remember, that it's not clear. There's a lot of unknown, undetermined, and gray right now. So looking at just where the lines are drawn in the sand and how we can understand this constitutional question. And this would, not only the topic, but all of this makes it a really difficult constitutional conversation, but that does not mean one we shouldn't have. So the more we practice about having these conversations, looking at our history, looking at the constitutional questions today in the courts and in the lower courts, then we can really understand where are we right now engaging the conversation to be open and civil. And I think you guys did an amazing job today. I want to wrap it up, but I feel really bad because Aaron put this question in the chat box like 3 times that I want to just, if you need to wrap up, but if you don't, Aaron would like to know, how was the Mulford Act able to be passed and stay law in the face of other reversals? So I just wanted to give Aaron that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So this is an act in California that repealed a law allowing public carry of loaded firearms. I mean, what it ends up teeing up again is, I think one of the real frontiers of Second Amendment law is, again, how is the Second Amendment going to apply from how is the Supreme Court going to take the right that they recognize in the House and apply it more broadly? And one of the sets of challenges that the Supreme Court's thought about taking over in recent years are these laws in states like California that make it relatively difficult to get a license to carry firearms outside of the home. And the way to look at it, so if you were Justice Thomas, if you were Justice Gorsuch, they said this when the court denied review of one of these laws a few years ago. The question is, are we going to treat, from their perspective, the Second Amendment as a second-class right? Or are we going to apply it like we do the First Amendment, very robustly, and guard those rights very jealously? In the First Amendment context, if you made, a licensing regime about, if it was a licensing regime that said, can you have a parade or can you not have a parade? We would say we want to give local officials no discretion. We want it to be just a mechanical thing to make sure we don't have 2 parades at the same time, but we don't want to give them broad authority to limit what's recognized as a core right of the Bill of Rights. And Gorsuch and Thomas and some of the justices say that's how we should apply the Second Amendment. On the flip side, there are people who argue that the better analogy in those situations is again to the First Amendment, but not to core speech, but instead to questions of time, place, and manner. And so that maybe similarly, we may want to give some discretion to state and local governments to regulate the interests on the one hand of individual gun ownership versus on the other hand the need to promote public safety, et cetera. And so again, these are really hard. These are hard questions, and it's hard to know exactly when the court's going to take them up and then exactly how they're going to decide them, because a lot of again, it's politically charged, but also a lot of laws are bound up in this, and the court's just trying to figure out the right approach to it now.
Yeah, and it's great to have these conversations and to continue them and in this exact way. So thank you guys so much. We will send you a brief on this. And it's great to have you all online. Awesome questions, very thoughtful. And I super appreciate the commentary going back and forth amongst each other in the chat box too. I love that. I feel like we're doing our job right when we have everybody in the dialogue. Thank you so much, Tom. You were a fantastic 1 p.m. session delivery. And I'm glad you guys all